Hey, I'm Trevor Green, and I'm the social media manager here at the GDDC. And today we will be talking about game mechanics and their association with genre. Basically, how your game's mechanics can be used to enforce and enhance your genre. Now, the first thing to take note of is this is a guide, not a rulebook. The tips I'm giving today are based on my own observations and some development tips I've picked up from various sources over the years. I will be covering very broad genres, so don't take what I say here as gospel. Now, first, RPGs. Now, for most games, it's important to plan out your features and mechanics ahead of time, but for no other genre is it more important than RPGs. RPGs are very balance reliant, and taking on new features even at early portions of game development can cause you a lot of headaches. Additionally, you should design your world to be supported by your mechanics. And when I say world, I don't mean the lore or the map. I mean things like enemies, items, and even player interaction should be made to work in tandem with your mechanics. A game like Fallout would probably not work as well if it had a JRPG style linear leveling system. Next are survival games. A way to make your survival game far more engaging is to reward players who think ahead. Consider adding some sort of resource or an item that is useless for short term survival, but crucial for long term survival, preferably with some downside for prioritizing it, like a wait system or limited time. Something that makes the early game harder while making the late game far easier can give the player a large sense of satisfaction. One of my favorite examples of this is Project Zomboid, where bowls, pots, and pans are completely useless at the start of the game, but as you get into the later in-game months, they become a crucial way to store water after water shuts off. Now, with puzzle games. You should try to make sure that the mechanics introduced later into the game build off of earlier mechanics. Now, even if you have a puzzle game with one set of starting mechanics that stays the same throughout the course of the game, you should make sure that your player can easily tell the extent of how the mechanics of the game interact. Think of a game like Portal. You start with a simple concept of move the box to the button. Then you can use the portal gun to move the box to the button. Then there are lasers that can be blocked with the boxes. Then there are special boxes that redirect lasers. Every time a new mechanic is added, the player can tell exactly how to use it to overcome whatever obstacle the game throws at them. With action games, you should aim for most player interaction to be as satisfying as possible. Games like Doom and TF2 are excellent examples of satisfying gameplay. Additionally, you should provide players with some intermittent downtime to let their adrenaline settle in a sense. Action is only exhilarating when there's also a lack of action. If you're running your game at full blast the entire play session, then the player will get burned out rather quickly. You also want action to progress in intensity as you progress through the game. This gives an added incentive for players to persevere through parts of the game that might be boring to certain players. Now, to a genre that has very similar conventions and a personal favorite of mine, horror. You should treat the player's fear in a horror game the same way you would treat a player's excitement in an action game. Have periods of increasing anxiety and then give the player some downtime. If you don't, you run the risk of desensitizing the player, having the scares get old. One of the most important takeaways for making a horror game is keeping gameplay unpredictable. If a player can know exactly how and when events will happen, then the scares will not land as well. When I say unpredictable, I don't mean making the game completely confusing. I mean forcing the player to make quick decisions with very little information. Force the player to rely on their wit and instincts. One of the biggest tips I've picked up on making horror games is this: victory should never be guaranteed. Horror games thrive when the player is forced to make a judgment call they weren't prepared for. Do your best to avoid creating, purposefully or accidentally, a strategy that will always work. Now, all this might make horror games sound much more in common with rage games, but no, because rage games have their own design guides. That's right, even smaller genres have specific design philosophies. With rage games, the main rule is that small mistakes should have large consequences, and those mistakes should only ever be the player's fault. If you punish a player in a rage game for failing a random chance, then you aren't making a rage game, you're making a game of roulette. Now, if I were to go on and talk about every design convention for every genre, we would be here until the internet dies. So the main thing I want you to take away from this meeting is this. When making your game, ask yourself, how will this mechanic or design choice help me draw from the player the reaction I want my game to have? Will this teach the player or confuse the player? Will this satisfy the player or anger the player? And more importantly, in this specific moment, which of those reactions do I want? If you aren't sure what reaction you want from the player in a specific moment, try looking at similar moments in games you know or have played. Always try to have an aim for the reaction you want from the player. Most importantly, getting the reaction you want from the player will sometimes mean deviating from standard design practices, and that's okay. Some of the most memorable games of this past decade are memorable because of how unorthodox they are. At the end of the day, as long as the experience you provided the player sticks with them long after their play session ends, you have accomplished your game's goal. And that's it. Thank you for listening.